Good evening. So fun to be here and to be part of this long investigation into work. Thank you, Hans-Ulrich, and everybody at the Serpentine. It's a coincidental pairing, Josh and myself, but my remarks will respond to his quite neatly. And I think what he was saying at the end there about the offense that people take at the idea that there might be a compensation without work points to the thing that I'm going to talk about, which is the centrality of work to Western ethics and metaphysics, and the fact that a world without work changes many things beyond just economics. So I want to make, I'll read for the sake of time. I want to make a very simple point. One that arises from my larger project, which Hans-Ulrich was referring to, After Nations, which lays out the gathering crisis in our world political system. And the point is this: when we contemplate a future in which human labor is more and more superfluous to the capitalist system, we must not imagine that the result will be unemployment in the current sense of the word. We mustn't imagine that we can simply extract work from the current equation and everything else will remain unchanged. Because work is the foundational principle of modern politics and even metaphysics. And if you remove work, everything else changes too. In the new mode of production, which we can start to anticipate, there are likely to be large-scale expulsions of people from the political system, and we cannot project existing notions of citizenship, political community, and nation-state into this future. So I want to leave you with some thoughts or some provocations about the transition we will be going through in the next few decades. But let's start by thinking about the transitions that went before. Our modern political reality came about when work acquired greater symbolic power than property. This was a long process which began at some point in the early 19th century and reached its climax after the Second World War. Before that transition, labor was essentially invisible, and property was the condition for political participation. All European states were dictatorships of propertied men. In the UK, it was about 3% of people who actually voted before 1800. The taxation system, which is the foundation of the nation-state, was blind to labor. There was tax on property and commodities, but not on income. It was in the 19th century that work made its transformative appearance. Balzac is one of the first truly modern voices. He understood the social totality in terms of the myriad kinds of work that people do. And he saw corporations, newspapers, and shareholders as the primary agents of history. Painting, and later photography and cinema, devoted themselves to making labor visible. Marx was entirely of his age when he came up with his labor theory of value. Before that, value was entirely abstracted from production. In the modern period, labor was value, labor was power. Labor could organize, strike, rise up, change history. Labor was able to bargain with the state and remake it in its own image as a huge labor cooperative. Work moved to the center of the taxation system. We had income tax. During the 20th century, the leisured classes all but disappeared too. The richest people worked, the poorest people worked, and their fortunes were mutually reinforcing. Part of the reason the 30 years following the Second World War are so fondly remembered today is because they had a ridiculously simple political logic. The state produced the population as workers through education. It also fostered capitalist organization that could absorb this labor and so delivered work to the entire population. Through this universal work cooperative, everyone also became political subjects. Citizens paid taxes on their salaries and enjoyed democratic participation. This logic was an admirably complete circle which left no untidy surplus. As we look back today, we can see that all of this was made possible because of a certain mode of production, which alone was able to support this compact between capital and labor, state and citizen. And today we are returning to the 19th century situation. Property is once again acquiring much greater symbolic power than work. After nearly a century of workaholic elites, we are now seeing the return of the leisured classes, as well as the rise of celebrity sports people and entertainers whose networked brand power is out of proportion to previous epochs. At the other end of the scale, in the poorest regions of the world, human labor is mostly superfluous to the contemporary extractive economy. And somewhere between these two extremes are the Western middle classes, who have historically taken a great share of the economic surplus. Ending the economy's dependence on this pampered group is one of the key objectives of contemporary capitalist innovation. The most radical and dynamic agents in this process today are the major technology firms, and it's worth thinking about the specific ways in which they completely disrupt the old familiar circle of labor, capital, and state. First of all, they destroy whole labor sectors and turn them into automated private monopolies. The work of hundreds of thousands of small bookshop owners and their staff is replaced by Amazon's automated platform. Hundreds of thousands of small taxi operators have succumbed to Uber. The old idea that the rationale for capitalism is to deliver employment is overturned. Second, they establish unpaid work as a core reality of our time. Facebook has nearly 2 billion members. If those 2 billion devoted only 10 hours a year to the platform, this 20 billion work hours would be much greater than was spent building all the production capacity of General Motors. But all this labor is unpaid. It is converted directly into property, not wages. As such, it does not circulate as taxation and has no political traction. And this model of unpaid work is now seeping back into the traditional economy, where all kinds of new work categories are being invented to allow employers to avoid paying salaries. Third, the fact that Google and Facebook pay no money to their workers is not a problem to them because, unlike General Motors, they do not rely on the working masses for their income. Such data companies earn nearly all their income from other companies. Industrial capitalism was based on the idea that everyone had the cash to consume products and generate economic growth. Today we have the prospect of something quite different. Pay nobody, charge them nothing, and circulate liquidity between capitalist concentrations. Fourth, ownership of all these companies is far more narrowly held than was the case with the industrial era giants. To build the plant of an organization like General Motors was such a monumental undertaking that it required mass investment, and ownership of the company was highly distributed. To build the plant of Uber is trivial in comparison. The founder still controls nearly all of the $60 billion company, and he employs only 1,200 people compared to the 600,000 who worked for General Motors at its height. And finally, these systems, which rival and sometimes replace the scale and power of the state, introduce no corresponding cooperative logic. Users who work for free and pay nothing for services also have no bargaining power. They sign a user agreement which deprives them of rights as a condition for their participation. Everything, in other words, that gave the old system narrative coherence is taken apart in the new. This new consensus provides the background to the next stage of tech innovation, whose major objective will be to remove human labor from the system in much more dramatic ways. Especially in the rich world, new generations of AI and robotics will gradually replace whole corporate departments, turning the workplace silent, ending 20th century office bustle and collegiality, and leaving behind only owners and strategists, and elsewhere their retinues of therapists, trainers, masseurs, maids, nannies, prostitutes, and the like. It's important to emphasize that this will not be like previous moments of technological innovation where there were false alarms about joblessness. In the past, new technologies opened up new sectors of administration and services and whole new areas of employment. But the past can do nothing to prove the future. And this time, the takeover of human labor is the explicit objective. Unless the entire Western middle class can be absorbed into the technology and finance sectors, and these too will be subject to increasing automation, it is difficult to see what remaining escape is open to them from mass joblessness. So, as with the old slave economies, labor itself will be turned into property. But whereas slave ownership was local, and individual slave owners could control only a limited fraction of the overall economy, the new owners of capitalism's productive powers will enjoy global monopolies over various kinds of physical and intellectual work. Taking over the labor of millions of previously well-paid workers, these monopolies will probably produce the world's first trillionaires. It is crucial to point out immediately that there are ideological objectives here, and it is not all about efficiency. As we've all seen in automated airports and supermarkets, workerless environments are not necessarily more efficient. The purpose here is also the spiritual destruction of work. Even before it is launched, the driverless vehicle proves that drivers are not needed and reduces truckers' bargaining position to zero. The libertarian dream of a clean capitalism without worker demands, where billionaire monopolists are the sole agents of history, this is a fantasy of class transcendence and has nothing to do with banal calculations of profit and efficiency. It is also important to note that just because this might destroy the entire capitalist system does not mean it will not happen. The ideology of contemporary monopolistic capitalism explicitly includes a death wish. The personality of Silicon Valley CEOs is devoted to world domination and destruction. They are already building their nuclear bunkers and artificial island fortresses. Just because finance is on its way towards total unreality does not mean that there is some moderation in the system that can bring it back. So what might happen? Conventional causation breaks down in the face of such ruptures, and no one can say with certainty. We can predict that when 30 or 50% of the population is superfluous to the economy, it will be quite different from 3 or 5%. That vast number will include some of the youngest, most educated, and ambitious people in society, who, on realizing there is no place for them in the corporate economy, will design new ideas of life. Whether creative or destructive, however, it is likely that contemporary political life will become unworkable. And I'm going to just present a couple of scenarios here, but we can include in the back of our mind what Josh has just been talking about universal basic income. So I'll just paint a few scenarios for you. The first of them is the easiest to imagine. The unemployed will cause such social chaos that the capitalist class will demand that the state intervene, as it has done several times in the last century. It might raise taxes and might try to deal with the situation through public works and welfare, but it's not clear how far the oligarchy would accept this kind of solution. The state might, as Donald Trump has already begun, try to reverse the 4-decade-long spatial reorganization of global production, bring mining back from Asia and Africa, bring manufacturing back from China, etc. This will be difficult to do fully or quickly enough. Global production now depends on different kinds of labor being subject to different levels of regulation and legal protection. And it's not clear if it's even possible to put all of it back into the same national space. Nor can we know if American Ivy League graduates would accept jobs assembling smartphones. And nor would any of this actually stop the processes of automation that have already begun. So any attempt to recreate majority employment by returning to earlier capitalist arrangements is unpromising. It is much more likely that the social chaos would be addressed by authoritarian means. The automation of policing and security systems will anyway remove many informal kinds of social negotiation and allow for greater interclass violence. And there will be strong pressure to withdraw political participation from many groups of people. War will be another tempting solution, especially given the new weapon systems. In some cases, foreign countries might come in to take control, since not all of the world will be affected at the same time by the same processes. Scenario 2 is that private wealth intervenes to occupy the unemployed in new ways. Of course, in the scenario we're talking about, it may actually be difficult for private wealth, which will be held in financial instruments, to be converted into cash. But we can imagine conferences of can-do oligarchs thinking up better lifestyles for everyone else. Large populations could be sustained on reservations. They wouldn't be part of the market anymore. They would not work or buy. They would just be sustained. They could do intellectual or spiritual work, for instance. Already many young, educated Americans choose to do fully funded graduate degrees rather than accept unpaid internships or unemployment. We could imagine a situation not unlike what happened for centuries in Europe, when very large numbers of men and women went into monasteries and converts endowed by elites, and so were removed from the main productive economy. There may not be any work to do in the future capitalist economy, but there is also so much work to do, spiritual, intellectual, and cultural. Perhaps the monopolistic surplus could be used to support this work as a general service to humanity. But the user agreement, again, would restrict the political expression of this majority. One minute. Third scenario, it's equally likely or even certain that new economies would arise amongst these very large numbers of the unemployed. Already in the rich world, there are alternative economic communities exchanging goods and labor amongst themselves and inventing new currencies that cannot be converted back into global money. The first instinct of many of the young unemployed would be to squat or forcibly seize land and property in order to grow crops and make products. And this alternative economy would itself quickly become global, having its own dynamics of wealth and poverty. We cannot know exactly how this economy would come to interact with the dominant corporate system, whether there would be peaceful non-interference, military conflict, or gradual absorption. But it's probable that in its early stages it would be outlawed or criminalized, and that this too would therefore result in the exclusion of many from the political system. In any of these scenarios, the political process would be stretched to its limits. Entirely new theories of political participation would be required, which is why probably the only scenario in which we might preserve something of what we know is that in which capitalism collapses, and the massive symbolic importance of property is reversed again in favor of work. This scenario cannot be excluded. The rich, as we know, save and invest. The poor spend. Without this spending, there may just be too little circulation of money to sustain the system. There would be a dramatic return of the real. The financial system would have no further degrees of abstraction to retreat into. The notional wealth of the capitalist class would collapse. An entirely new cycle of capitalist innovation might then begin, with much of the wealth of the previous cycle wiped out and value being built around new forms of reality requiring enormous labor. Most likely of all is that all these scenarios will take place together in various combinations. The political consequences are therefore very difficult to see clearly at present. But I leave you where I started. The removal of work from the center of the Western meaning system will change every other aspect of life. Thank you.